Welcome to Christian Analytics. This channel is dedicated to in-depth analysis of topics relevant to Christians. I'm going to look at data, I'm going to look at scripture, so get out your calculator and get out your Bible and let's get started. Today's video is specifically about Israel and its demographics, its population growth rate and its birth rates, Jewish and Muslim. Around 20 years ago, the Jewish birth rate was much lower than the Muslim birth rate, but today this has changed. Both are now about equal. Much of the media is fixated on this old data, pretending that Israel is still demographically doomed if it doesn't cave into all the outside pressure of a two-state solution. However, Israel is now not only safely Jewish, but the current trends point to a growing majority for Jews even if they annex the West Bank. I'm going to go through the data and prove it to you. I also want to talk about the prospects for annexing Palestinian territory. One of the sleight of hands that the media seems to do constantly, and I've seen it from a number of sources, is that they'll only do comparisons if Israel annexes the entire Palestinian territories, both the West Bank and Gaza. And yes, if they did that, the Jewish majority would become very close to disappearing. And there might be a chance that it would become Muslim majority or Jewish minority. But that's not the only option on the table. And in fact, if they choose to just annex the West Bank, they'll be just fine. So I'm going to explore those details as well and come up with my suggestion for what Israel should do going forward. First, though, I want to give a definition of terms. I know not everybody is completely aware of all the geography in Israel, the Palestinian territory, the Golan Heights, etc. So I want to define those things. What I'm not going to do is go through a history of the annexation process, the War of 1967, but I am going to give a little bit of background for biblical reference. What you see now is a Google map of Israel. You'll notice that there's a mix of hard lines and dashed lines, and this is because of the controversy surrounding who controls what. I'm highlighting now the West Bank. There is an indentation on the west for Jerusalem, and on the east is the Jordan River. In Jesus' time, these areas were referred to as Judea and Samaria, Judea being the bottom half and Samaria the top half. Various translations of Judea over the centuries is actually where we get the English term Jew. This is the historic homeland of the Jewish people. This is also the location of Jesus' birthplace in Bethlehem and numerous other spots he visited during the gospel accounts. Now, if you look to the west, you'll see that I've highlighted the Gaza Strip. It butts up against Egypt along the shore of the Mediterranean. For most of the Old Testament, Gaza was controlled by the Philistines and is less central to Jewish history, with very few settlements. For Christians, the only point of interest is that Jesus probably traveled through the Gaza Strip while fleeing Bethlehem as a small child, and then again passing through back from Egypt to Nazareth as a young boy. Now I'm showing you the Golan Heights in the north. The Golan Heights is not actually under the authority of the PLO, that is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It is disputed land between Israel and Syria, and I'm just mentioning it for completeness. It only has about 40,000 people in it, being about half Jewish and half Muslim, so it doesn't really move the needle that much on total demographics. And finally, defining Israel itself. What I have on the screen are the pre-1967 war borders. None of this land is under any real dispute, but to prevent confusion, I'm going to call this area the core of Israel. When I refer to Israel, I'm referring to all the land that is currently under Israeli control, which includes the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. The image you are seeing now is a graph of the total fertility rate of the core of Israel in 2000, then later in 2016, and on the far right of the West Bank in 2017. So very briefly, the total fertility rate is the number of children that each woman gives birth to. To maintain a level population, also known as the replacement ratio, the total fertility rate has to be around 2.1. That is, each woman needs to have more than 2 children to maintain a level population. For a frame of reference, every single country within the 35-member OECD, that is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has a total fertility rate below 2.1. This group includes major democracies including the US, Mexico, Japan, the UK, etc. In the U.S., the fertility rate now, as of 2017, is 1.76, well below the replacement ratio. In countries like South Korea, it's extremely low at around 1.25. That means that the U.S. and South Korea and all other developed countries will eventually begin to shrink without outside inflows. In the chart you see the total fertility rate in 2000 for Jews was 2.6. This is represented by the blue bar on the left. Now, 2.6 was an exceptionally high fertility rate for a developed country, but it still paled in comparison to the very high rate of 4.3 by the Israeli Arabs. It was this gap in the demographic growth rate that led many in Israel and others around the world to support accommodating policies towards Palestinian secession. Given that the fertility rates of both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were very high, annexation of those lands was considered suicidal for a Jewish homeland. This situation was called a demographic time bomb by a number of analysts in the past. There was a legitimate fear in Israel that Jews would eventually become a minority in their own country. And during those years where this situation existed, the former Prime Minister of Israel went so far as to say, anyone who doesn't have more than 4 children is a traitor. And that is David Ben-Gurion. Facing an existential threat like this, Jews began to change their family creation habits by eschewing small families for much larger ones. So it wasn't just the Orthodox Jews who continued to have very large families, but also conservative and secular Jews began to increase their family sizes, and the Israeli government gave subsidies to encourage this to happen. As you can see from the chart, by 2016, in the middle, the Jewish total fertility rate had matched the Arab birth rate. The Jewish fertility rate had actually reached 3.16, while the Israeli Arab birth rate had dropped to 3.11, slightly lower. And this was the culmination of a number of years of change. And newspapers like the Times of Israel and even the left-wing Haaretz blared the good news late in 2016 when the stats came out. This meant that the demographic time bomb had been diffused. On a side note, for full disclosure, I did find a strange report released in 2017 that the Palestinian Arab fertility rate had actually held at 3.29. This was released by the same Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics instead of the 3.11 mentioned earlier. Both numbers are available at their website in different media releases, so it's not clear where the second higher number came from. However, as you look at my chart closely, you'll see a faint yellow bar graph which represents that possible second number. Nonetheless, the final result still holds. The fertility rates are very similar, and along with Aliyah, there is very little chance that the Palestinian Arabs will surpass the Jewish population this century unless these trends change. In this chart below, it shows the percent of each age group that is Muslim. As you can see, starting from the right, that the Muslim percentage in older generations is much smaller. Not only were there fewer Muslims, but their lifespans were much lower. The upward trend to the left continues, showing an ever-growing percentage of the population as Muslim, and this is almost unabated until you reach the young adult cohort. It is here that you can see the birth rate surge by Jews, as their percentage of the whole begins to grow and Muslims shrink. So for now, we can see that the demographic time bomb seems to be over. However, all these statistics just show the stability of the core of Israel. It doesn't tell us anything about the West Bank and Gaza. Going back to the prior slide, we can see the total fertility rate of Jews and Arabs in the West Bank as of 2017. The Jewish fertility rate, comprised heavily of large family Orthodox settlers, is nearly twice that of the Palestinian Arab population, coming in at 5.07 for Jewish women and calculated at 2.78 for the Palestinian Arabs. Without getting too much into the weeds, this implies a natural population growth rate nearly 3 times as high for the Jews as for the Palestinian Arabs. According to the CIA World Factbook, the Jewish population in the West Bank as of July 2017 is over 21%. This will steadily climb in the years ahead. When making a population projection for Jews in the West Bank, one has to be careful. The political situation is very complicated. The Jewish population cannot simply go browse the newest master plan community in suburban Jerusalem. The country has extensive red tape to open up new development because of the tense political considerations between Israel, the PLO, and the international community. However, as Israel has grown more confident in recent years, the Knesset, that is the Israeli parliament, has been increasingly willing to defy certain international pressures and expand the settlements. Having said that, I've performed what I consider to be a conservative projection of the Jewish and Arab populations in the West Bank. In this chart, the Jewish population is approaching parity with the Palestinian Arab population by 2070. My personal guess is that the Palestinian Arab birth rate will continue to fall due to a few factors that include urbanization and a loss of ideological fervor as the Jewish population notably increases. Something else not captured under this projection is Jewish immigration to Israel and into the West Bank. Under Aliyah, the Jewish return to the homeland, the Central Bureau of Statistics shows that around 20,000 Jews move into Israel on net every year. Because Judea is considered the core of the ancient homeland of Jews, some immigrant Jews, as well as a significant number of Israeli Jews, want to move into the West Bank for ideological reasons. I made no effort to capture that flow at all, but my gut tells me that the 50-50 Jewish-Muslim parity will be reached earlier than 2070 in the West Bank, perhaps as early as 2055. Now your question might be, what about the Gaza Strip? And the simple answer is this. Israel should not think of annexing the Gaza Strip for any reason whatsoever. Demographically, the Gaza Strip is over 98% Palestinian Arab, having virtually no Jews at all. Their fertility rate is quite high, higher than the core of Israel at 4.3. Now, sometimes Palestinian birth rates are exaggerated for ideological reasons, but I don't really have a doubt that they have a high fertility rate, even if 4.3 is a slight exaggeration. Today, the population of Gaza is approaching 2 million, and as I said earlier, it is almost exclusively Palestinian Arabs. From a safety standpoint, the Gaza Strip, being led by Hamas, has been far more violently anti-Israel than the Fatah-run West Bank Palestinians. So I do not recommend that Israel think of annexing the Gaza Strip for any reason whatsoever. So now that we've dispensed with the idea of annexing Gaza, let's go back and analyze the idea of annexing just the West Bank. In the new chart, you see a comparison of the population compositions before and after annexation of the West Bank. So currently, the West Bank Jewish population is relatively small, at around 600,000 people. So there's only a very minor increase to the total Jewish population of around 10%. The Palestinian Arab population, however, in the West Bank is actually larger than the current Arab population in the core of Israel, at around 2.1 million in the West Bank as opposed to 1.8 million in the core of Israel. The combined population would yield about 7.2 million Jews and about 4 million Palestinian Arabs. So rather simplistically, this gives Jews a significant majority. And then when you throw in the fact that fertility rates that we viewed earlier are pretty comparable in the core of Israel, they have Aliyah, where Jews are entering Israel through immigration, and then also the fact that the fertility rate for Jews in the West Bank is much higher than the Palestinian Arabs. The Jewish population would be a majority, stay a majority, in fact, would become increasingly dominant over time. However, in the complicated real world of politics, I would recommend a slow, incremental annexation of the West Bank for two reasons. A full and immediate annexation of the entirety of the West Bank would shift the political makeup of Israel dramatically to the left. The Jewish left, and obviously the Arab populations, are not committed to a Jewish identity in Israel, as opposed to the current conservative bloc in power under Benjamin Netanyahu. Slow annexation, especially of Jewish-dominated areas within the West Bank, would maintain the political will to protect the Jewish identity of Israel. It would also allow the favorable demographic trends I've shown to slowly reduce the political consequences of annexation. Am I smearing the Jewish left? I would say not at all. Virtually all left-wing groups have historically been anti-large family, believing in overpopulation speculations. These theorists have been repeatedly proven way off, starting with Thomas Malthus, who predicted calamity back in 1798, and more recently Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book, quote, The Population Bomb. We now have a world growing more and more obese instead of their predictions of mass starvation. Both the Jerusalem Post and the Haaretz had repeatedly preached capitulation to the Palestinians because of Israel's demographic doom. Then, in less than a year after the demographic crisis had been solved by increasing Jewish birth rates, they began to preach doom because Jews are having too many children, again indulging in long-debunked overpopulation theories. First, we have this selection of headlines from the Jerusalem Post. Birth rates, quote, unsustainable, racing towards disaster, quote, Israel's unsustainable population bomb, directly quoting Ehrlich. We can see that regardless of the demographic situation, the left is encouraging Jews to behave in ways that would limit their national strength and identity. However, I will say that their estimation of the core of Israel surpassing 15 million people in 35 years is actually pretty conservative. I would project that Israel passes that number in about 25 years. The more stridently left-wing newspaper Haaretz doesn't waste time with such realism, though. Neda Ahituv warns that Israel could explode to 36 million people by 2050 in just 32 years. So taking Taking current trends, I find this absurdly high. This is double the population estimate that I'm coming up with. Other bylines include, quote, the demographic demon rearing its head again. This is the twisted morality that thinks that giving birth to children is evil. They even question whether Israel should exist in the future. Quote, will Israel still exist in 90 years from now? Should it? Can there be any doubt that Israel's secular left is not an advocate for Jewish identity in Israel? I think the most obvious clue to the source of the revulsion is the small line that says, quote, the ultra-Orthodox are having 6.5 children on average. They dislike religious Jews, and they dislike the Torah when it says, be fruitful and multiply. Back to the second reason to do a patient, piecemeal annexation of the West Bank. My reasoning here is less numeric and more geopolitical. A full and immediate annexation might invite a violent response from both the Palestinian Arabs and neighboring countries. Suddenly dislodging the hope of statehood could cause raw emotions to boil over. The international community would almost certainly condemn this. Slow annexation would allow Palestinian Arabs to come to terms with the future reality, while Israel cautiously changes the security apparatus on the ground. Of course, who am I that Israel would listen to me? I would answer they don't have to because they are already ahead of my suggestions. In this op-ed printed at the Jerusalem Post, Moshe Dan argues for a partial annexation of Area C of the West Bank. Now, he doesn't delineate the geographic extent of this action, but according to his estimates, the area planned for annexation is overwhelmingly populated by Jews. This would serve to enhance the Jewish advantage in the core of Israel and give security to those settlers within this area. So now, repeating what I've built up in this video. If Israel desires to pursue a Jewish nation within its historical boundaries, it should slowly begin to annex the West Bank because demographic trends are on their side. But Israel should absolutely jettison Gaza. How to do that jettison peacefully is beyond my expertise, but it should either choose to give them sovereignty or arrange a merger with Egypt. Reflecting on all this data brought to mind two future discussion topics. One is an admiration for the Jewish people in the pursuit of God's command to be fruitful and multiply. This is a phrase that's mentioned 6 times in Genesis alone, and it's how the Jews today are surviving and flourishing, and it may provide lessons for Christians as our influence in the culture is waning. Secondly, how does this inform my views on premillennialism? Is this what a premillennialist would expect to see? Hopefully I can answer those questions for you in a future video. Ask me questions in the comments and I may be able to answer those as well. If you enjoyed this video, click like, and if you want to see future videos with this kind of depth, hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching Christian Analytics.